The 1948 Palestinian exodus from Lydda and Ramle, also known as the Lydda Death March, was the expulsion of 50,000–70,000 Palestinian Arabs when Israeli troops captured the towns in July that year. The military action occurred within the context of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The two Arab towns, lying outside the area designated for a Jewish state in the UN Partition Plan of 1947, and inside the area set aside for an Arab state in Palestine, subsequently were transformed into predominantly Jewish areas in the new State of Israel, known as Lod and Ramla. The exodus, constituting the biggest expulsion of the war, took place at the end of a truce period, when fighting resumed, prompting Israel to try to improve its control over the Jerusalem Road and its coastal route, which were under pressure from the Jordanian Arab Legion, Egyptian and Palestinian forces. From the Israeli perspective, the conquest of the towns, designed, according to Benny Morris, to induce civilian panic and flight, averted an Arab threat to Tel Aviv, thwarted an Arab Legion advance by clogging the roads with refugees, forcing the Arab Legion to assume a logistical burden that would undermine its military capacities, and help demoralize nearby Arab cities. On the 10th of July, Glubb Pasha ordered the defending Arab Legion troops to make arrangements for a phony war. The next day, Ramle surrendered immediately, but the conquest of Lydda took longer and led to an unknown number of deaths. The Palestinian historian Aref Aref, the only scholar who tried to draw up a balance sheet for the Palestinian losses, estimated 426 Palestinians died in Lydda on the 12th of July, of which 176 in the mosque and 800 overall in the fighting. Israeli historian Benny Morris suggests up to 450 Palestinians and 9 to 10 Israeli soldiers died. Once the Israelis were in control of the towns, an expulsion order signed by Yitzhak Rabin was issued to the Israel Defense Force stating, 1. The inhabitants of Lydda must be expelled quickly without attention to age. Ramle's residents were bussed out, while the people of Lydda were forced to walk miles during a summer heatwave to the Arab front lines, where the Arab Legion, Transjordan's British-led army, tried to provide shelter and supplies. A number of the refugees died during the exodus from exhaustion and dehydration, with estimates ranging from a handful to a figure of 500. The events in Lydda and Ramle accounted for 1/10 of the overall Arab exodus from Palestine, known in the Arab world as al-Nakba. Some scholars, including Ilan Pappé, have characterized what occurred at Lydda and Ramle as ethnic cleansing. Many Jews who came to Israel between 1948 and 1951 settled in the refugees' empty homes, both because of a housing shortage and as a matter of policy to prevent former residents from reclaiming them. Background: 1948 Palestine War. Palestine was under rule of the British Mandate from 1917 to 1948. After 30 years of intercommunal conflict between the countries, Jews and Arabs, the United Nations voted to partition it into a Jewish and an Arab state on the 29th of November 1947, with Lydda and Ramle to form part of the latter. The proposal was welcomed by Palestine's Jewish community but rejected by the Arab leaders, and civil war broke out between the communities, triggering the 1948 Palestinian exodus, wherein 700,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, or fled. British authority broke down as the civil war spread, although they maintained an air and sea blockade. The British Mandate expired on the 14th of May 1948, and the State of Israel declared its independence on the same day. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War resulted, with forces from Transjordan, Egypt, Egypt, Syria and Iraq entering the country and engaging the Haganah. Strategic importance of Lydda and Ramle. Lydda dates back to at least 5600–5250 BCE. Ramle, 3 kilometers away, was founded in the 8th century CE. Both towns were strategically important because they sat at the intersection of Palestine's main north-south and east-west roads. Palestine's main railway junction and its airport were in Lydda, and the main source of Jerusalem's water supply was 15 kilometers away. Jewish and Arab fighters had been attacking each other on roads near the towns since hostilities broke out in December 1947. Israeli geographer Arnon Golan writes that Palestinian Arabs had blocked Jewish transport to Jerusalem at Ramle, forcing the Israelis to build a bypass called the Burma Road. Israel had launched several ground or air attacks on Ramle and Latran in May 1948, and Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, developed what Benny Morris calls an obsession with the towns. He wrote in his diary that they had to be destroyed, and on the 16th of June referred to them during an Israeli cabinet meeting as the Two Thorns. Lydda's local Arab authority, officially subordinated to the Arab Higher Committee, assumed local civic and military powers. The records of Lydda's military command discuss military training, constructing obstacles and trenches, requisitioning vehicles and assembling armored cars armed with machine guns, and attempts at arms procurement. In April 1948, Lydda had become an arms supply center, and provided military training and security coordination for the neighboring villages. Operation Danny. Israel subsequently launched Operation Danny to secure the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road and neutralize any threat to Tel Aviv from the Arab Legion, which was stationed in Ramallah and Latran, with a number of men in Lydda. On the 7th of July, the IDF appointed Yigal Allon to head the operation, and Yitzhak Rabin, who became Israel's prime minister in 1974, is his operations officer. Both had served in the Palmach, an elite fighting force of the pre-Israel Jewish community in Palestine. The operation was carried out between the 9th of July 1948, the end of the first truce in the Arab-Israeli War, and the 18th of July, the start of the second truce, a period known in Israeli historiography as the 10 Days. Morris writes that the IDF assembled its largest force ever, the Yiftach Brigade, the 8th Armored Brigades, 82nd and 89th Battalions, 3 battalions of Kiryati and Alexandroni infantrymen, an estimated 6,000 men with around 30 artillery pieces. Scienteti Como and Casa. Lydda's defenses. In July 1948, Lydda and Ramle had a joint population of 50,000–70,000 Palestinian Arabs, 20,000 of them refugees from Jaffa and elsewhere. Several Palestinian Arab towns had already fallen to Jewish or Israeli advances since April, but Lydda and Ramle had held out. There are differing views as to how well defended the towns were. In January 1948, John Baggett Glubb, the British commander of Transjordan's Arab Legion, had toured Palestinian Arab towns, including Lydda and Ramle, urging them to prepare to defend themselves. The Legion had distributed barbed wire and as many weapons as could be spared. Lydda had an outer line of defense and prepared positions, an anti-tank ditch and field artillery, as well as a heavily fortified and armed line northeast of central Lydda. Israeli historians Alon Kardish and Avraham Seller write that the Arab National Committee, a local emergency Arab authority that answered to the Arab Higher Committee run by the Grand Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, had assumed civic and military control of Lydda, and had acquired arms, conducted training, constructed trenches, requisitioned vehicles, and organized medical services. By the time of the Israeli attack, they say the militia in Lydda numbered 1,000 men equipped with rifles, submachine guns, 15 machine guns, 5 heavy machine guns, 25 anti-tank launchers, 6 or 7 light field guns, 2 or 3 heavy ones, and armored cars with machine guns. The IDF estimated that there was an Arab Legion force of around 200 to 300 men. Lydda contained several hundred Bedouin volunteers and a large-sized force of the Arab Legion. They argue that the deaths in Lydda occurred during a military battle for the town, not because of a massacre. Against this view, Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi writes that just 125 legionnaires from the 5th Infantry Company were in Lydda. The Arab Legion numbered 6,000 in all, and that the rest of the town's defense consisted of civilian residents acting under the command of a retired Arab Legion sergeant. According to Morris, a number of Arab Legion soldiers, including 200 to 300 Bedouin volunteers, had arrived in Lydda and Ramle in April, and a company-sized force had set itself up in the old British police stations in Lydda and on the Lydda-Ramle road, with armored cars and other weapons. He writes that there were 150 legionnaires in the town in June, though the Israelis believed there were up to 1,500. An Arab Legion officer was appointed military governor of both towns, signaling the desire of Abdullah of Jordan to stake a claim in the parts of Palestine allotted by the UN to a Palestinian Arab state. But Glubb advised him that the Legion was overstretched and could not hold the towns. As a result, Abdullah ordered the Legion to assume a defensive position only, and most of the legionnaires in Lydda withdrew during the night of 11-12 July. Kardish and Seller write that the National Committee stopped women and children from leaving, because their departure had acted elsewhere as a catalyst for the men to leave too. They say it was common for Palestinian Arabs to leave the homes under threat of Israeli invasion, in part because they feared atrocities, particularly rape, and in part because of a reluctance to live under Jewish rule. In Lydda's case, they argue, the fears were more particular. A few days before the city fell, a Jew found in Lydda's train station had been publicly executed and his body mutilated by residents who, according to Kardish and Salah, now feared Jewish reprisals. Fall of the cities, air attacks and surrender of Ramla. The Israeli Air Force began bombing the towns on the night of 9–10 July, intending to induce civilian flight, and it seemed to work in Ramla. At 11:30 hours on the 10th of July, Operation Danny headquarters told the IDF that there was a general and serious flight from Ramla. Quote, that afternoon, Danny HQ told one of its brigades to facilitate the flight from Ramla of women, children, and the elderly, but to detain men of military age. On the same day, the IDF took control of Lydda Airport. The Israeli Air Force dropped leaflets over both towns on the 11th of July telling residents to surrender. Ramla's community leaders, along with 3 prominent Arab family representatives, agreed to surrender, after which the Israelis mortared the city and imposed a curfew. The New York Times reported at the time that the capture of the city was seen as the high point of Israel's brief existence. 2 different images emerged of Ramla under occupation. Khalil Wazir, who later joined the PLO and became known as Abu Jihad, was evicted from the town with his family, who owned a grocer's store there. When he was 12 years old, he said there was fear of a massacre, as there had been at Deir Yassin, and that there were bodies scattered in the streets and between the houses, including the bodies of women and children. Against this, the writer Arthur Koestler, working for The Times, visited Ramla a few hours after the invasion, and said people were hanging around in the streets as usual. A few hundred young men had been placed in a barbed wire cage, and were being taken in lorries to an internment camp. Women were bringing them food and water, he wrote, arguing with the Jewish guards and seemingly unafraid. He said the prevailing feeling seemed to be relief that the war was over. Moshe Dayan raid on Lydda during the afternoon of the 11th of July. Israel's 89th Battalion, led by Lt. Colonel Moshe Dayan, moved into Lydda. Israeli historian Anita Shapira writes that the raid was carried out on Dayan's initiative without coordinating it with his commander, using a column of jeeps led by Imam and Harrington armored car with a cannon taken from the Arab Legion the day before. He launched the attack in daylight, driving through the town from east to west, machine gunning anything that moved, according to Morris. Then along the Lydda Ramle road, firing at militia posts until they reached the train station in Ramla. Kaddish and Sella write that the troops faced heavy fire from the Arab Legion in the police stations in Lydda and on the Lydda Ramle road, and Dayan described the town's entrance was awash with Arab combatants. Hand grenades were thrown from all directions. There was a tremendous confusion. A contemporaneous account from Jean Caravan for the New York Times also said the firing met with heavy resistance. Dayan's men advanced until the train station where the wounded were treated, and returned to Bet Shemen under continued enemy fire from the police stations. 6 of his men were killed and 21 were wounded. Kenneth Bilby, a correspondent for the New York Herald-Tribune, was in the city at the time. He wrote, "Raced into Lydda with rifles, stands, and submachine guns blazing. It coursed through the main streets, blasting at everything that moved. The corpses of Arab men, women, and even children were strewn about the streets in the wake of this ruthlessly brilliant charge. The raid lasted 47 minutes, leaving 100 to 150 Palestinian Arabs dead, according to Dayan's 89th Battalion. The Israeli side lost 6 dead and 21 wounded." Kaddish and Sella write that the high casualty rate was caused by confusion over who Dayan's troops were. The IDF were wearing keffiyehs and were led by an armored car seized from the Arab Legion. Residents may have believed the Arab Legion had arrived, only to encounter Dayan's forces shooting at everything as they ran from the homes. Surrender and unexpected shooting in Lydda by Arab Legionnaires. Although no formal surrender was announced in Lydda, people gathered in the streets waving white flags. On the evening of the 11th of July, 300–400 Israeli soldiers entered the town. Not long afterwards, the Arab Legion forces on the Lydda Ramle road withdrew, though a small number of legionnaires remained in the Lydda police station. More Israeli troops arrived at dawn on the 12th of July. According to a contemporaneous IDF account, groups of old and young, women and children streamed down the streets in a great display of submissiveness, bearing white flags, and entered of their own free will the detention compounds we arranged in the mosque and church, Muslims and Christians separately. The buildings soon filled up, and women and children were released, leaving several thousand men inside, including 4,000 in one of the mosque compounds. The Israeli government set up a committee to handle the Palestinian Arab refugees and their abandoned property. The committee issued an explicit order that forbade to destroy, burn or demolish Arab towns and villages, to expel the inhabitants of Arab villages, neighborhoods and towns, or to uproot the Arab population from the place of residence without having previously received a specific and direct order from the Minister of Defense. Regulations ordered the sealing off of Arab areas to prevent looting and acts of revenge, and stated that captured men were to be treated as POWs, with the Red Cross notified. Palestinian Arabs who wished to remain were allowed to do so, and the confiscation of the property was prohibited. The town dignitaries were assembled and, after discussion, decided to surrender. Lydda's inhabitants were instructed to leave the weapons on the doorsteps to be collected by soldiers, but did not do so. A curfew for that evening was announced over loudspeakers. A delegation of town dignitaries, including Lydda's mayor, left for the police station to prevail upon the legionnaires there to also surrender. They refused and fired upon the party, killing the mayor and wounding several others. Despite this, the 3rd Battalion decided to accept the town's surrender. Israeli historian Yoav Gelber writes that the legionnaires still in the police station were panicking, and had been sending frantic messages to their HQ in Ramallah. "Have you no God in your hearts? Don't you feel any compassion? Hasten aid." Quote, they were about to surrender, but were told by HQ to wait to be rescued. On the 12th of July, at 11:30 hours, 2 or 3 Arab Legion armored cars entered the city, led by Lt. Hamadallah al-Abdullah from the Jordanian 1st Brigade. The Arab Legion armored cars opened fire on the Israeli soldiers combing the old city, which created the impression that the Jordanians had staged counterattack. The exchange of gunfire led residents and Arab fighters to believe the Legion had arrived in force, and those still armed started firing at the Israelis too. Local militia once again renewed hostilities, and an Israeli patrol were set upon by a rioting mob in the marketplace. The Israeli military sustained many casualties, and viewing the renewed resistance as a surrender agreement violation, quickly quelled it, and many civilians died. Kaddish and Seller write that, according to the 3rd Battalion's commander, Moshe Kelman, the Israelis came under heavy fire from thousands of weapons from every house, roof and window. Morris calls this nonsense, and argues that only a few dozen townspeople took part in what turned out to be a brief firefight. Massacre in Lydda. Gelber describes what followed as probably the bloodiest massacre of the Arab-Israeli War. Shapiro writes that the Israelis had no experience of governing civilians and panicked. Kelman ordered troops to shoot at any clear target, including at anyone seen on the streets. He said he had no choice. There was no chance of immediate reinforcements, and no way to determine the enemy's main thrust. Israeli soldiers threw grenades into houses they suspected snipers were hiding in. Residents ran out of their homes in panic and were shot. Jeroim Cohen, an IDF intelligence officer, said around 250 died between 11:30 and 1400 hours. However, Kaddish and Seller state that there is no direct first-hand evidence that a massacre took place, other than a few dubious Arab sources. They say that a reconstruction of the battle suggests a better, albeit more complex, explanation of the Arab losses, which also casts severe doubt on, if it does not completely refute, the argument for the massacre in the Al-Umari Mosque. Quote, this view has been criticized. Quoting from Kaddish and Seller's paper, John W. Poole concluded, on the morning of July 12, 1948, the Palmach forces came under heavy fire from thousands of weapons from every house, roof and window, sustaining heavy casualties. These assertions seem to be the foundation for much of the argument advanced in the article. I think that the authors should have furnished much more information about the precise meaning, factual validity, and sources. He continues with, he does not say how many townspeople were involved in the fighting, but his account certainly suggests a number of Arab gunmen, very much smaller than several thousand. James Bowen is also critical. He places a cautionary note on the UCC website, It is based on a book written by the same authors which was published in 2000 by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Palestinian historian Aref placed the death toll at 426, including 179 he said were later killed in one of the mosques, during a confusing incident that sources variously refer to as a massacre or a battle. Thousands of male Muslim detainees had been taken to two of the mosques the day before. Christian detainees had been taken to the church or a nearby Greek Orthodox monastery, leaving the Muslims in fear of a massacre. Morris writes that some of them tried to break out, thinking they were about to be killed, and in response the IDF threw grenades and fired anti-tank rockets into one of the mosque compounds. Kardish and Seller say it was a firefight that broke out between armed militiamen inside the mosque and Israeli soldiers outside and responding to attacks originating from the mosque. The Israelis fired an anti-tank shell into it, then stormed it, killing 30 militiamen inside. In 2013, in testimony provided to Zokro, Yerachmiel Kathanovich, a Palmach fighter present on the scene, stated he himself, amid the shelling of a mosque, had fired a PI-80 anti-tank missile with enormous shock-wave impact inside the mosque, and on examining it afterwards found the walls scattered with the remains of people. He also stated that anyone straying from the flight trail was shot dead. According to Morris, dozens died, including unarmed men, women and children. An eyewitness published a memoir in 1998 saying he had removed 95 bodies from one of the mosques. When the shooting was over, bodies lay in the streets and houses in Lydda and on the Lydda Ramle road. Morris writes that there were hundreds. The Red Cross was due to visit the area, but the new Israeli military governor of Ramle issued an order to have the visit delayed. The visit was rescheduled for the 14th of July. Dani HQ ordered Israeli troops to remove the bodies by then, but the order seems not to have been carried out. Dr. Klaus Dreyer of the IDF Medical Corps complained on the 15th of July that there were still corpses lying in and around Lydda, which constituted a health hazard and a moral and aesthetic issue. Quote, he asked that trucks and Arab residents be organized to deal with them.